Thanks, James, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to run through the results of the Service Department survey that we conducted a few weeks ago. So thanks to those of you who responded. I'm also going to touch on the findings from our most recent European Service Department report as well. So the key underlying message emerging from both projects is that yes, demand is significantly tempered due to the COVID-19 crisis, but on the whole, the Service Department sector is well placed to recover more efficiently from the current issues brought about by COVID-19. And in fact, just to emphasize the point, over 87% of respondents answered yes when asked whether they thought service departments were better positioned to recover from COVID-19 compared to the wider hotel market. The other 13% were unsure. So no one actually believes that service departments are in a worse off position, which is positive news for the sector. So why is this? Well, I think there are a number of key reasons why, but fundamentally, most respondents were in agreement that the configuration of service department properties is key for a quicker recovery. With more self-contained units, self-catering facilities, as well as contactless check-in and therefore less contact with staff members. All of these reasons leading to better social distancing than in perhaps a traditional hotel, and therefore leading to guests feeling safer on the whole. Another key reason, drawing on the results of the survey, is that service department providers believe that professional cleaning standards and higher hygiene regulations are key to enticing visitors over this period of recovery. We also have the fact that service departments typically have better in-room facilities, particularly work from home facilities, and therefore could be deemed better value for money, boding well for corporate guests. Which is vital considering the average share of demand accounted for by corporate guests is usually around 68.5%. Now, what this breakdown generally means as well is that the average length of stay is far greater than alternative accommodation types. For those respondents who measure over 50% of their demand coming from corporate guests, their average length of stay is usually around 33.5 days. And so this longer length of stay will help to boost occupancy for some operators and support profitability throughout the next however many months of recovery. And this is something we've seen over the duration of the lockdown period as well, with more service department properties managing to stay open over this period due to the longer length corporate stays who have been able to self-isolate within these properties. And as a result, we've seen a higher actual occupancy rate for those service departments that have managed to stay open compared to the wider hotel market. Another interesting point from the survey is that while many operators suggest that corporate guests dominate demand today, looking forward 12 months, many operators, in fact over 40%, believe the bulk of demand will come from either leisure guests or an equal mix of corporate and leisure. And that's more than we've seen in any previous survey. And I think that's going to be pivotal for recovery across some operators in terms of diversifying their demand pool and attracting leisure guests that perhaps want to stay in self-contained units for their own safety while social distancing measures are still in place. And that's one of the key reasons as to why we've seen service department operators becoming more concerned about the importance of their online profile, with the results from the June survey actually suggesting that operators are placing a higher importance on their online profile than we've ever recorded in these surveys before. Now, one could argue that this is due to a more competitive market during periods of reduced demand, but I think it's also a result of higher expected demand from leisure guests who perhaps rely more heavily on online marketing for their bookings. So moving on to the question that everyone wants to know the answer to, when are we likely to see a recovery? Now, it's obviously extremely difficult to try and estimate when we could see a pickup in tourism, particularly from overseas, given the international travel restrictions and compulsory quarantine measures that are currently in place. Some sources are suggesting that we'll see an uptick in international arrivals next year, driven by European visitors, and that's been mimicked in the results of the survey, with the bulk of demand in 6 months' time expected to be dominated by UK and European visitors. This is perhaps as expected, with demand from all other longer haul regions projected to decline in comparison to the results of previous surveys. Now, some sources are in agreement that we won't reach 2019 levels of total international arrivals until at least 2023, but ultimately I think this will be largely determined by the timing of the vaccination. And in the meantime, we can expect to see domestic demand pick up. And while it might not be enough to fill the void left by international arrivals, it could at least start the recovery in many markets, particularly regional, typical tourist destinations. And that's what we've seen across some of the European countries that have already reopened. So we asked service department operators when they think occupancy rates will reach pre-COVID, so 2019 levels. Over half suggested 2021, with 25% of all respondents actually suggesting they'd reach this level within the first half of next year. So a fairly optimistic outlook in terms of recovery to occupancy over the short term, suggesting that majority of operators believe that demand will only be subdued for 1 year, which is pretty promising for the sector as a whole. Now, there are, however, some short-term headwinds as expected, and I've pulled out those deemed to be the top 5 biggest challenges facing service department providers over the next 3 years. And I think they're quite obvious, really. Economic headwinds caused by the COVID-19 crisis is the number one reason, with over 90% of operators listing it as a challenge, as well as corporate travel budgets, which kind of ties into that same economic headwinds bracket. However, just to caveat that quickly, off the back of the GFC, we did actually experience an improvement in operational performance to service apartments across London, in line with corporates deeming the sector to be a more cost-effective alternative for hotel stays for temporary and contract staff. And we might not see the same pickup in the shorter term due to a lack of corporate demand. This could be a feature for the medium to longer term. The other major headwind is a logistical one around demand, be it either from social distancing measures or international travel restrictions. So one last thing I wanted to touch on before I finish is from our European Service Department report, and that's whether there's still scope for expansion within the sector. Now, obviously, within the current climate, uncertainty has significantly tempered development appetite across the wider hotel market, with a number of projects either being put on hold or cancelled altogether. However, for service departments, the longer term confidence appears to be justified. As you can see here, service departments across the top 10 cities in Europe, that's top 10 in terms of supply pre-COVID, still only represent a small portion of total hotel stock, averaging around a 9.6% share, with some markets like Amsterdam and Madrid coming in well underneath that level. And this relatively limited supply does provide some support for recovery to service department occupancy in the shorter term due to a lack of similar competition. But it also points towards longer term development opportunities, which could bring about more investment opportunities across Europe from new buyers. And on top of that, the current resilience shown by the service department sector is shining a light on service departments, which could actually attract new buyers in the market. So just to recap briefly, yes, the current situation is continuing to impact demand, with travel restrictions and economic headwinds expected to present challenges over the next few years. However, service departments are forecast to recover more efficiently than the wider hotel market, largely due to better safety measures and social distancing options in place. And finally, looking forward, occupancy is expected to climb again in 2021, with the supply-demand gap expected to reopen expansion opportunities and development potential over the longer term. Thanks for listening.